You're too quiet, too reserved, and too careful to ever become truly powerful, she said while comparing me to her more outgoing ex during a family gathering. I stayed silent and walked away without resistance. Months later, her father unexpectedly asked me to speak at his company event instead of the ex she chose over me. You're too quiet, too reserved, and honestly too careful to ever become truly powerful. She said it at her parents' dining table. 8 people sitting around it. Her mother mid-bite. Her aunt holding a wine glass. Her younger brother staring at his phone until he wasn't anymore. The room went still in that specific way rooms go still when someone says something they can't take back. Candace didn't lower her voice when she said it. She didn't whisper it to me privately later, didn't save it for an argument at home. She said it right there, at that table, with the chandelier light catching the centerpiece flowers her mother had arranged, and then she laughed softly and glanced toward Jerome like she was inviting him to agree. Jerome smiled. Not a cruel smile. More like the smile of a man who already knew he'd won something. I looked down at my drink. I didn't defend myself. Didn't straighten up and make a speech. Didn't look around the table for someone to back me up. I just held the glass and let the moment pass over me. Her father, Richard, sat at the head of the table. He hadn't said anything. But when I looked up briefly, he wasn't looking at Jerome. He wasn't looking at Candace. He was looking at me. I didn't think much about that at the time. I thought the humiliation was the worst part of that night. I was wrong. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 28 when all of this started. Candace was 26. We'd been together almost 2 years. Met at a networking event in Midtown Manhattan. One of those overpriced cocktail hours where everyone's trading business cards they'll never follow up on. She was in marketing. I was doing financial analysis at a mid-size investment firm. We talked for 40 minutes in a corner while the rest of the room performed for each other. That was what I liked about her at first. She could cut through the noise. She was sharp, socially confident in a way I wasn't, and she laughed at things that were actually funny instead of just laughing because the room was laughing. We dated casually for 3 months, then not so casually. By month 6, she was keeping things at my apartment in Brooklyn. By month 10, her mother knew my name, and her father had shaken my hand twice. It was good. For a while, it was genuinely good. I should have paid more attention to when it stopped being good. The shift was gradual. Not a single fight. Not a single explosion. Just a slow cooling. The way a room gets cold when someone leaves a window open overnight. You don't notice it until you're already shivering. She started mentioning Jerome about 4 months before that dinner. At first it was casual. Jerome's firm is doing really well. Then it was comparative. Jerome always knew how to work a room, you know? People just gravitate toward him. Then it became a kind of measuring stick she'd hold up next to me without realizing she was doing it. Or maybe she realized. I'm still not entirely sure. Jerome was her ex from college. They'd dated for about a year before she moved to New York. He'd followed her eventually. Moved to the city about a year before I came into the picture. They stayed friends. That part didn't bother me. I'm not territorial about history. What bothered me was subtler than that. It was the way she'd describe him. Jerome just has this energy. People want to be near him. He walks into a room and something shifts. She'd say it without looking at me. Like she was narrating something she missed. Like she was trying to make me understand a language I didn't speak. I understood it fine. I just didn't perform it. The dinner at her parents' house in Westchester happened on a Saturday in October. Jerome was there because he'd recently become friendly with her younger brother. That's how Candace framed it when she told me he'd been invited. Marcus really likes him, she said. Dad doesn't mind. It's just dinner. Just dinner. I drove us up from Brooklyn. We barely talked in the car. She was on her phone most of the way, texting someone, and the music on the radio was filling the silence in that uncomfortable way where both people notice the silence, but neither addresses it. I noticed a lot of things that night. Jerome arrived 20 minutes after we did. He came in already talking, loud laugh, immediate handshakes, some story halfway finished before he was fully through the door about something that had happened on the way over. Marcus loved it. Candace's mother smiled wide. Her aunt touched his arm when she laughed. He was good at it. I won't pretend he wasn't. He moved through the room like he'd been there 100 times. Comfortable everywhere. The kind of man who treats every room like it's already his and gets away with it because the confidence is convincing. He had broad shoulders, an easy smile, and the ability to make anyone feel like they were the most interesting person he'd spoken to in weeks. I sat near the bookshelf and watched. That wasn't unusual for me. I've always been better at observing rooms than performing in them. I noticed things, The way people position themselves, who talks to who, what somebody means when they say the opposite of what they mean. It's useful in my work. It's less useful at dinner parties. Candace drifted toward Jerome within the first 20 minutes. Not dramatically, just socially, the way water finds low ground. Her father, Richard, fixed himself a drink at the bar cart by the window and watched the room the way I was watching it. He caught me looking at him once and nodded, just slightly. A small acknowledgement. I nodded back. Dinner itself was fine until it wasn't. The conversation moved around the table comfortably for a while. Marcus's job, a trip someone was planning, the neighborhood changing, real estate. Then Jerome told a story about a pitch meeting he'd been in that week. It was a good story. Polished. The kind of story that's been told a few times and refined each time until all the rough edges are gone. Everyone laughed. That's what I mean, Candace said, after the laughter settled. That kind of presence. You can't teach that. She was looking at Jerome when she said it. But then she looked at me, and I understood immediately that the second part of that sentence was about me. I didn't take the bait. I picked up my fork. Looking back, I should have recognized that she wanted me to react. Wanted me to push back, get competitive, prove something. She'd been waiting for me to do that for months. She wanted me to step into the arena and fight for position the way Jerome would have. But that's not how I'm built. I don't fight for position. I build it. She didn't understand the difference yet. You're too quiet, too reserved, and honestly too careful to ever become truly powerful. That line came maybe 20 minutes after the story. The dinner had shifted to a looser post-meal conversation, people talking across each other, wine refills happening. She said it in a gap between other conversations, loud enough to land. Her mother looked down at her plate. Her aunt took a sip of wine and found something interesting in her glass. Marcus looked up from his phone. Jerome smiled that smile. And Richard, at the head of the table, went completely still. I looked at my drink. Didn't argue. Didn't perform dignity. Didn't try to look unbothered by trying too hard to look unbothered. I just sat with it. After a moment, I pushed back my chair quietly, excused myself, and went to stand on the back porch. Cold October air. Neighbors' lights through the trees. The muffled sound of conversation and laughter still coming from inside. I stood there for a few minutes. Then the sliding door opened behind me. I expected Candace. It was Richard. He came and stood next to me, holding his drink. He didn't say anything for a moment. Just looked out at the yard. Then he said, "You didn't bite." I looked at him. "Most men would have," he said. "Good instinct." He went back inside. I stood on that porch for another few minutes, processing that, before I followed. The drive back to Brooklyn was quiet. Not the same quiet as the drive up. That had been comfortable silence stretched thin. This was the kind of quiet that has a shape to it, specific, weighted, full of things neither person wants to say first. She said, "Around the Bronx. You didn't even try tonight." Try what? To be present. To engage. Jerome was the life of the room, and you were just there. I kept my eyes on the road. "I was there," I said. "That's not what I mean, and you know it." I knew exactly what she meant. She meant she wanted me to be Jerome. She wanted the big laugh and the story and the easy magnetism and the whole performance. She wanted a man who filled rooms with sound. I fill them differently, or I don't fill them at all, depending on how you measure it. "Candace," I said, "I'm not going to compete with him. I'm not asking you to compete. I'm asking you to show up." I was there the entire evening. Being physically present isn't the same as showing up. I didn't respond to that. She turned toward the window. That wasn't even the worst part. The worst part came 2 weeks later, when she stopped pretending she wasn't comparing me to him constantly and started doing it openly, like the effort of disguising it had become too exhausting. Jerome got a promotion. Jerome's speaking at this conference. Jerome thinks you should look into a different sector. That last one landed differently. He was advising her on my career now. That was new. I looked at her when she said it. "Jerome thinks," I repeated. She shrugged. "He knows the industry. He knows a version of it. You're being dismissive. I'm being accurate." She made a face like I'd said something small. Like I'd confirmed something she already suspected about my limitations. I let her make the face. But something had shifted for me in that moment. Quietly, without announcement, I moved from hoping things would improve to simply noting that they wouldn't. The final conversation happened in my apartment on a Tuesday evening in November. No drama. No screaming. No thrown objects or slammed doors. She sat across from me on the couch and said, "I think we want different things." I said, "Okay." She seemed thrown off by that. Like she prepared for resistance and wasn't sure what to do without it. "I care about you," she said. "I want you to know that. I know you do. But I need someone with more energy, more ambition, someone who goes after things. I looked at her for a moment. I wanted to say, I go after things. Quietly, carefully, in ways that compound over time instead of burning bright and fast. I didn't say it. What would be the point? She had already decided what she saw when she looked at me, and no speech I gave in that moment was going to change the picture. That's the thing about perception. It's stickier than reality. Once someone decides you're one thing, you have to do something extraordinary to become another thing in their eyes. I was not interested in performing the extraordinary for her benefit. Okay, I said again. She left. Her confidence walking out that door was absolute. She genuinely believed she was making an upgrade. I didn't argue with her. I cleaned up the apartment, made coffee, and opened my laptop. Here's what she didn't know. For the previous 8 months, I had been quietly developing something I hadn't told many people about. My firm had given me lead responsibility on a mid-market restructuring deal. Not flashy, not the kind of thing that gets written up in the press or turns you into a name people drop at cocktail parties, but complex, demanding work that required real precision, the kind of financial architecture that looks simple from the outside and is anything but. I had also, over the course of that year, built a small but specific reputation in a narrow professional circle. I don't network loudly. I never have. I don't work rooms. I don't collect contacts like trophies. But I am meticulous. I do what I say I'll do. I respond when I say I'll respond. When I give someone an analysis, it's accurate. When I make a projection, I've stress-tested it from 6 angles. That kind of reputation doesn't make noise. It travels differently. Slower. Underground, almost. But it travels. I didn't know, at the time, that Richard had started paying attention. Candace's father had built his company over 30 years. He ran a mid-sized business consulting firm that operated mostly in the corporate finance space. Strategy, operational efficiency, the unglamorous work of making companies actually function. He was well regarded in that world. Not famous. Respected. The kind of man who becomes respected the same way I was working toward it. Not by filling rooms with noise, but by being exactly right when it mattered. I found out later that he'd asked about me. Not to Candace. Not right away. He'd asked a contact of his, a man who worked tangentially in my professional circle, what kind of reputation I had. The answer, apparently, was a good one. The months after the breakup were not glamorous. I won't pretend there was no pain. There was. Not the dramatic, consuming kind that breaks routines and derails everything. The quieter kind that sits in the early morning hours and the 30 seconds before sleep, when you're too tired to keep it managed. I missed her. Or I missed the version of her I'd spent the first year with, before the comparison started. The woman who could cut through noise. That person was real. I'm certain of it. But grief, for me, has always been functional rather than performative. I got up. I went to work. I ran in the mornings because I always ran in the mornings. I made meals, kept the apartment clean, stayed in contact with the 3 or 4 people whose presence actually mattered to me. I didn't post anything about the breakup. Didn't make any public display of having moved on. Didn't show up anywhere looking deliberately successful. I just worked. The restructuring deal I was leading moved into a more complex phase. I was putting in long hours, not the kind you announce, just the kind you put in. I started getting pulled into conversations at the firm that I hadn't been pulled into before. Not dramatically, just incrementally. A senior partner asking my read on something. A client requesting me specifically for a follow-up call. Small things. The accumulation of small things. Meanwhile, I heard pieces of what was happening with Candace and Jerome, not through active searching, just through the peripheral information that arrives anyway when you share a social world with someone. A mutual contact mentioning something in passing, a social media post I caught briefly before scrolling past. They were together. Officially. Jerome had posted something about it. A photo from some event, the 2 of them dressed up, him with his arm around her, his smile at full wattage. The comments were full of people saying how great they looked. They did look great. That's the thing about Jerome. He understands optics. I kept running in the mornings. I kept working. It was a Thursday in March when I got the message. I almost didn't recognize the number. It wasn't saved in my contacts. The message was short, just a name, a brief description of what he was looking for, and a question about whether I'd be willing to have a conversation. It was Richard. I stared at the message for probably 10 seconds before I responded. We met for coffee that Friday, a place near his office in Midtown. He was already there when I arrived, reading something on his phone, and he stood when I came in and shook my hand with the same calm, direct grip I remembered from the 2 times we'd met before. "I'll be straightforward with you," he said, after the coffee arrived. "I appreciate that. I have an annual company event coming up in May. It's a big one for us, clients, partners, people I want to strengthen relationships with. I typically have a keynote speaker, someone who talks about financial strategy, market positioning, where things are moving." I nodded. "I had someone in mind," he said. "He fell through." He paused. "I've been asking around about you for a few months," he said. "The feedback has been consistent. And I remember watching you at dinner, the way you think, the way you don't react when you're supposed to react." He looked at me steadily. "I trust that more than I trust a good story." I was quiet for a moment. "I'd be honored," I said. He nodded once. "Good." He didn't mention Candace. I didn't mention her either. We spent the rest of the coffee discussing the event, the audience profile, what he was looking for in terms of content and tone. When I walked back to the subway, I didn't let myself process the full weight of what had just happened. I just started thinking about the presentation. Here's what I found out later, and I want to be precise about this, because the sequence matters. The person Richard had originally planned to feature at the event was Jerome. Jerome had made a pitch for it. Through Marcus, initially. Marcus had mentioned him to his father as someone with presence, someone the room would respond to. Richard had agreed to have a conversation with him. Jerome had been enthusiastic, charming, all the things Jerome always was. But something hadn't landed. I don't know the exact details of that conversation. I have a partial picture from what Richard told me later, in pieces, and from what I put together from the surrounding context. What I know is that when Richard pressed Jerome on substance, not performance, not energy, but actual analytical depth about the topics the event would cover, Jerome had been vague in the wrong ways. Not dishonest, just shallow. The kind of shallow that's invisible at dinner parties and visible in rooms where precision matters. Richard had shelved the idea quietly and started asking around. And the name that kept coming back was mine. I spent 6 weeks preparing for that presentation. I treated it like the most important deliverable I'd worked on in years. Not because it was a performance. I'm not built for performance. But because Richard's audience deserved accurate, genuinely useful content. These were professionals who had seen enough presentations to know the difference between substance and style. I built the entire framework from scratch. I stress-tested every claim. I had a colleague I trusted review the financial projections I cited. I ran through the structure 4 times before I felt the architecture was right. I didn't practice being charismatic. I just made sure every single thing I said was worth saying. The event was at a venue in Midtown on a Thursday evening in May. I arrived early and spent 20 minutes walking the space, stage, sight lines, acoustics, where the audience would be positioned. I talked to the AV coordinator, made sure the slides would render correctly, asked about the microphone setup. Then I found a quiet corner and reviewed my notes once more. People began arriving around 6. Cocktail hour. The room filled with the sound of a well-funded professional event. The quality of the suits, the caliber of the conversation, the specific kind of energy that exists in rooms where everyone has built something. I was standing near the side of the room when I saw her. Candace. Of course she was there. It was her father's event. I'd known there was a reasonable possibility. She was with Jerome. He was in his element, working the room, handshakes, easy laughs, the whole performance at full volume. She was beside him, looking beautiful, looking proud. Then she saw me. The sequence of her expression was quick, recognition, then surprise, then confusion. She hadn't expected me here. She didn't know. Jerome saw her expression shift and followed her gaze. He saw me. He kept his smile intact, but I could see him recalibrating. He didn't know why I was there either. I nodded at both of them calmly. Then I went to check on the presentation setup. Richard found me backstage about 10 minutes before the program started. "You ready?" he asked. "Yes." He looked at me the way he'd looked at me at that dinner table, steady, measuring, not performing anything. "She didn't know you were the speaker," he said quietly. It wasn't quite an apology, more like information delivered without embellishment. "I figured," I said. "I didn't plan it this way intentionally," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I invited you because you were the right person for this." "I know," I said. He nodded. Then he went out to greet his guests. They introduced me cleanly. No oversell, no theatrics. Just my name, my role, the topic. I walked out. The room was full. 200 people, maybe more. Tables, low lighting, the attentiveness that happens when cocktail hour ends and the program begins. I found Candace in the audience without looking for her. She was very still. Jerome was beside her. He wasn't still. He was adjusting in his seat, recrossing his legs, doing the small physical things people do when they're recalibrating a situation they weren't prepared for. I looked at the room as a whole. Then I started talking. I won't reproduce the whole presentation here. What matters is what it was and wasn't. It wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. There were no dramatic pauses for effect, no rhetorical flourishes designed to get applause. It was precise. It was well-constructed. It was built to give these people something genuinely useful to take out of the room with them. About 10 minutes in, I noticed the quality of the silence. Not boredom. The other kind. The kind where people stop shifting in their seats because they're actually following. Where the pen tapping stops and the phone checking stops, and you can feel the room leaning slightly forward. That kind of silence. I've learned that this is what real attention sounds like. It doesn't make noise. Afterward, there were the conversations that follow these things, a line of people with questions or comments, the kind of professional engagement that signals the content actually landed. Richard shook my hand and held it an extra beat. Exactly what I needed, he said. We should talk more. I said we would. I spent 40 minutes talking to people from the audience. An asset manager who wanted to discuss one of the points I'd made about market positioning. A CFO who had a question about a methodology I'd referenced. A woman who ran a mid-size firm who handed me her card and said, "I've been looking for someone who thinks like this." I was in one of those conversations when I noticed Jerome approach Richard from the side of the room. I couldn't hear what was said. I could see it. Jerome talking, Richard listening. The body language was Richard being politely present while Jerome worked. The smile, the gestures, the performance. Richard standing with a glass in his hand, and the particular stillness of a man who has already made his assessments. It lasted about 3 minutes. Then Richard made an excuse and moved on. Jerome stood there for a moment, smile slightly reconfigured. Candace found me near the end of the event. Most of the room had thinned out. Jerome was across the venue talking to Marcus, and she crossed the floor alone, which told me something. She stopped a few feet away. "I didn't know you were speaking tonight," she said. "I know. My father called you." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She had the specific expression of someone who has been carrying a conclusion for months and has just found evidence that it might be wrong. She wasn't certain yet. She was still absorbing. "You were very good," she said finally. I didn't answer right away. "Thank you," I said. Another pause. "I said some things," she started. "Candace." I kept my voice even. "It's okay. It wasn't forgiveness. I want to be precise about that. It was over. The whole thing. The comparison, the dismissal, the dinner table, the drive home, the Tuesday in November. It was behind me and the distance felt appropriate and clean." She looked at me the way she used to look at Jerome. Like she was seeing something she'd missed. Like she was recalculating. I recognized the look. I felt nothing sharp at seeing it. Just the quiet recognition of something completed. "I should get back," I said. I shook her hand once, something that seemed to surprise her, and crossed the room toward the exit. Richard saw me on the way out and gave me that same steady nod. I nodded back. Same as the first time. Outside, the city was doing what Manhattan does on Thursday nights in May. Taxis, voices, the ambient roar of 10,000 things happening simultaneously. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the air. I thought about that dinner table in October. The chandelier light. Her voice carrying across the room. The way everyone went still. The way I looked down at my drink. The way I didn't argue. People have always misread that as not having an answer. I had an answer. I just already knew that room wasn't worth giving it to. There are things I know now that I didn't articulate clearly then. Silence is not the absence of something. It's a decision. It's the decision to not spend yourself on moments that don't warrant it. To not empty your account on transactions that won't return value. To move carefully and deliberately and let the work itself carry the argument. Jerome understood rooms. He understood them deeply, professionally, at a level I'll probably never match. He could walk in and make people feel something in 30 seconds. That's a real skill. I'm not dismissing it. But Richard wasn't hiring for 30 seconds. He was hiring for what happens when the 30 seconds end. And that, the sustained thing, the structural thing, the thing that holds weight under examination, that was mine. Always had been. I just couldn't show it to people who weren't looking. The months that followed were different. Richard and I talked more. He brought me in for a project in the fall, consulting on a restructuring effort one of his clients was navigating. It was exactly the kind of work I was built for. My name started traveling in different rooms. Not with noise. The same way it had always traveled. But further. The woman who'd given me her card at the event. We had 3 serious conversations over the following months. Something may come from that. It's still forming. I don't know what the next version of my life looks like exactly, but for the first time in years, I feel like I'm building in the right direction. I heard, through the margins of the social world we still partially share, that things with Candace and Jerome hit difficulty somewhere around late summer. I don't know the details. I didn't ask. It's not satisfaction I feel about that. It's more like the acknowledgement of a pattern. The recognition that what looks like power from a distance sometimes isn't. That performance without depth has a shelf life. She'll figure out what she needs. Maybe she already has. I hope she does. That's genuine. The last thing I'll say is this. I've stopped explaining myself. Not in an aggressive way. Not in a closed-off way. Just the energy I used to spend hoping people would understand what they were seeing when they looked at me. I've redirected that. Put it somewhere useful. The people who matter figure it out. Richard figured it out from a porch in October without me saying a word. That's the only validation that ever counted. At the end of that night, after the event, after the conversations, after Candace's expression shifted, I stepped into the elevator alone. The doors closed. The reflection in the polished metal doors showed a man in a dark suit, standing straight, looking calm. I thought about what she'd said. Too quiet, too reserved, too careful to ever become truly powerful. I almost smiled. For the first time in a long time, I understood something clearly. She hadn't been wrong about what she saw. She'd just been wrong about what it meant. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. I walked out into the city.